Okay, so this is some work based on a slideshow that was left to me by Laura Hartel at the American International School in Bucharest, and the author of the slideshow is also Tiffany. So acknowledgement is given to the two authors. I've just adapted it and updated it for the grade 11 class of 20 who will be in grade 12 in 2016. So we're looking at the pro-democracy movement in China between 1979 and 1989. This is for paper 1 for Communism in Crisis. And you can see here this picture of Ma Dasheng talking to crowds in front of the Communist Party Municipal Building in 1979. And certainly check out the link at the bottom of the page there, and there's a nice overview of some of the work that he did and some of the artists in his cooperative as the democracy movement takes off in the late 70s and early 80s. So obviously Deng really wants to modernize China at this time. He's launched those 4 modernizations, and we also are beginning to see the impact there in terms of development in China. The key thing to remember though is that Deng is really only a reformer in the economic sense, and certainly not in the kind of political sense, and certainly not in terms of any type of sort of democracy and modernizing China. He wants to create a loyal country. He wants to create a situation where people are going to work together for the good of China economically. But remember, we often see when times and countries try to modernize, there's that kind of urban middle class develops, people who want to protect their wealth, people who want to have a say in how they're taxed, people want to make sure that their money and their businesses are going to be safe. That's when the demand comes for political change. And those of you studying higher level, we've also seen those China challenges in Alexander II's Russia as well. Using the PATHAC textbook, you can investigate these things in more details, but remember, as those modernizations take charge, there's definitely costs and benefits for China. Those challenges as we get the 2 economies develop in China, those coastal special economic zones where, you know, business is booming and people are moving in and out, compared to the continuing poverty in rural areas, and in fact even more so as people are migrating from rural areas to work in the big cities. Inflation increases, causing price rises which many peasant and farmhold households struggle to deal with, and income inequality. A problem that perhaps still remains and exists in China today is to do with corruption, particularly what's called taizidang, which is when you have the children of party officials managing to get their fingers into all these kind of business pies and things like that. And also we have the thing that China has largely managed to avoid in many ways is the development of kind of urban underclasses. It's beginning to develop, but certainly not to the extent in some other LEDCs. But there are plenty of benefits. Those town and village enterprises are producing income for people, and household responsibility system is increasing crop yields. More foreign investments coming in. The army's getting modern. So lots and lots of benefits. And also in the PATHAC book on page 60, you can see some summaries from the different historians about their opinions of the costs and benefits of the 4 modernizations. But remember, while Deng is definitely an economic modernizer, not so much a political modernizer, and he develops these 4 cardinal principles to keep people and keep the politics where he wants them to be. And so we see a real contrast here between those modernizing ideas for the economy and definitely a steady as she goes type of attitude when it comes to the politics of China to maintain the current structure. And the 1980 People's Congress deletes an article from the Constitution that prevents freedom of speech. So definitely a tightening and a harder management of the political situation in China at this time. Going back, of course, we can track lots of these pro-democracy issues back to the Tiananmen incident of 1976 at the memorial of Zhou Enlai, and also that Beijing Spring, that couple of years afterwards, where we do see a number of pro-democracy publications and perhaps a kind of a bit more of a cultural challenge from artists and writers in particular. But remember, that's kind of fairly firmly dealt with by 1978, 1979. But just to remember, there's that legacy there with that memorial of Zhou Enlai. And of course, we're going to see the same in April 1989 with the memorial to Hu Yaobang. So Deng, remember, is incredibly powerful in the party, and his lack of official titles in no way kind of reflect his status. And remember that he'd kind of farmed out many of the other jobs. Zhao Ziyang, remember, also is the premier of China at this time. Hu Yaobang was fairly well liked. He's an old sidekick of Deng from the kind of Long March days, so they've kind of got that political pedigree that we often look for in our Chinese communist leaders. And perhaps like many other people, including Deng himself, he'd kind of been bounced in and out a bit by Mao. And he'd done his bit certainly to try and perhaps protect some of the more intellectual types in China from sort of Deng's occasional campaigns. So Hu kind of represents, again, I mean, a slightly more rightist view than that. But remember, when we're talking about rightists in China, we're talking about people to the right of the Gang of Four. We're not certainly talking about people who are right-wing in any other sense of the word. So this democracy movement takes its shape really and kind of manifests itself in many cities in different ways, but the key area to focus really on is Beijing, this democracy wall, where there's been a long tradition of people kind of putting their words on display. And we've seen these types of exposés before. We've seen the 100 Flowers campaign, we've seen the big character posters of the Cultural Revolution, and so those types of things are part of sort of Chinese culture and part of intellectual discussion and prompts. It certainly wasn't organised. You could come along and post up your big character poster about anything at all that was bothering you, whether that was conditions in a particular factory or you're a disgruntled professor at university. So there's no kind of organisation, method or leadership with this democracy wall. It was really free for anybody to have a look at. The posters talk about all different types of things, and they begin over time to kind of honour the principles, particularly when it comes to the four modernizations and so on. But it's the change that actually happens with one particular poster that's published where people, and it's from Wei Jingsheng, and he puts this up in 1979 to ask for he asked this kind of rhetorical question, what is democracy? He's a former Red Guard, but like all good students, he goes on to answer his own question. And if you can see here, he talks very clearly about the right of people to sort of nominate their own representatives, and that these representatives will work in the interests of those people. So a very important idea, and probably a big reaction to the corruption that was going on in China at this time. And also something else that's important is that these representatives can be replaced. So another kind of key idea, an issue that's happening at this time. So that's really where the kickoff for perhaps the shift in the democracy wall comes through. Wei Jingsheng, of course, is arrested for his troubles, and he spends the next 15 years in prison in a kind of work education camp. And that harsh punishment is there as a warning to others to avoid their same behaviours there. Corruption really is a huge issue, and it still is today in China, and there's still lots of government crackdowns on corruption up until this day. It's an issue that the Communist Party are having to take very seriously. There's a huge scandal in the 1970s. The CCP put the criminals onto public trial, and it really sort of embarrassed the government. But at the same time, they were hoping that kind of with this big expose, they would show that they were taking corruption and corruption issues seriously. And petty corruption is still very much going on today in terms of kind of getting through red tape and getting bureaucrats to help you and stuff like that. So this big indicator is perhaps people begin to question that it's a symptom of something much bigger. Overseas, there's a couple of challenges from foreign events. In 1984, Ronald Reagan visits China, and he makes a speech calling for greater political freedom. Well, clearly it's censored, but samizdat copies get handed around fairly quickly, particularly among student groups. And perhaps overseas as well, one of the big inspirations perhaps, or certainly in the consciousness of many of those first students in 1989, was the incredible and amazing story of the People Power Revolution in 1986 in the Philippines. And again, that idea that peaceful protests could change a dictatorship. So there's some powerful things happening overseas and some big ideas spreading in the mid-80s. By the 1980s, student protests are picking up a little bit. Remember, there's also inspirational activities in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, with the growing power of solidarity. And things kick off in different places. Really, Shanghai has the first huge student protest, and it's the work of Fang Liji, an astrophysicist, who begins to kind of get students motivated and get student activity going, and it's kind of crushed fairly quickly. Hu Yaobang is also pushed out in 1987, and this is the beginning of the start of perhaps of a tightening up from the CCP in terms of where's going on. It's Zhao Ziyang who replaces him as General Secretary when Hu goes in 1987. Deng is very quick to condemn, and he's very quick to try and push Fang Liji out of the picture and reduce his impact. You can click on the little video YouTube there and see some of the stuff that's going on from the news in 1986. So he's really pushing hard against what's happening. And to finish off for today's class, I'm going to ask you to trace back really what we've been doing over the past couple of sessions and have a look at what caused the protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989. So backtrack right to the big context, the four modernizations and the challenges that they have produced for urban and rural China. Have a look at the increasing demands for political influence. You've got that legacy from 1976, the democracy wall, of course, and what people are posting up and what people are saying. Pathak on page 75 through to 80 has little subsections on students, workers, artists and writers, so have a look at that. As I said, if you're interested before, have a look at Ma Desheng as well. You can find the link on the first slide of the PowerPoint, and have a look at how the CCP handles the pressure. So you need to be ready to talk about them. What's the build-up? What are the causes to the protests? And of course, they'll start in April 1989 as a response to the death of Hu Yaobang, and that's where we'll pick up. Thanks for watching.